There was a body under my bed, and no one believed me. When I was 12, something happened that still sends chills down my spine. I swear there was a body under my bed, but no one believed me. It started on an ordinary evening. I was sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor, sorting through my marble collection. My prized tiger's eye marble slipped from my fingers and rolled under the bed. Without thinking, I stretched out my hand to grab it, feeling around in the darkness. That's when I touched her hand. At 12, the only hands I'd ever held were my parents' when I was little. But this was different. The hand was ice-cold, lifeless, and foreign. I yanked my hand back like I'd touched a live wire and scrambled backward until my back hit the wall. My chest tightened as panic gripped me, and I just sat there, staring at the bed, too afraid to move. After a moment, I mustered enough courage to crawl forward on all fours and peer under the bed. My heart pounded as I lowered my face to the floor, inching closer. That's when I saw them, eyes. The most piercing blue eyes I'd ever seen stared back at me. They were so intense, so vivid, that I can still see them clearly in my mind to this day. The next thing I knew, I was lying on my bedroom floor, waking up to the worried faces of my parents hovering over me. My older sister, Jill, stood nearby, pale and wide-eyed. She told me I'd let out a blood-curdling scream and passed out cold. The memory came rushing back as soon as I sat up. My hands were trembling as I blurted out the truth. There was a body under my bed. My parents exchanged skeptical glances, clearly not buying it. They said it was just a bad dream, my imagination running wild. But I wasn't letting it go. I begged them to check, insisting over and over that I knew what I'd seen. Eventually, my persistence wore them down, and they agreed to investigate. I waited on the couch, curled up into a ball, my hands clamped over my ears. I was bracing myself for the inevitable scream, my mother's horrified shriek when she found what I'd seen. But the scream never came. Instead, when I cracked my eyes open, my parents were standing in front of me, their expressions not of fear but of irritation. "There's nothing under your bed, Jake," my dad said sternly. "This isn't funny. We don't have time for silly pranks." My mom shook her head in exasperation. "You've got a vivid imagination, sweetheart, but enough is enough." Their dismissive tone made me second-guess myself. Had I really seen what I thought I did? My parents were the no-nonsense type, especially my dad, so their annoyance stung more than their disbelief. Still, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, I couldn't forget the feel of that hand. And I could never unsee those eyes. That evening, I avoided my room like the plague. Even when bedtime came, I wanted to protest, but the stern look my father gave me stopped any argument in its tracks. With shaky legs and shallow breaths, I stepped inside. The room looked the same as it always did, normal. It felt normal. Even smelled normal. Relief started to trickle in, paired with the heavy exhaustion of the day's events. I quickly changed into my pajamas and dove under the covers, wrapping myself up as though the blankets could shield me from whatever was out there. To my surprise, sleep came easier than I'd expected, but it wasn't peaceful. The nightmares started almost immediately. Those piercing blue eyes were everywhere. Every face I saw wore them, staring into my soul. In my dream, I ran through crowds of people moving in slow motion, their hands clawing at me, grabbing at my limbs and clothes. Their mouths moved like they were begging for something, but no words came out. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The room was dark and still. I glanced toward the window, no sunlight yet. It was early. Too early. But something felt wrong. The air in the room seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The unease coiled in my stomach. I knew I had to look again. Better to get it over with now than let it haunt me until sunrise, I thought grimly. Reaching into the drawer of my bedside table, I fumbled around until my fingers brushed the familiar shape of my flashlight. I smacked it against my palm to get it working, the dim beam flickering to life. "It's not real. It's not real." I repeated the mantra in my head like a broken record. After giving myself the most convincing mental pep talk I could muster, I crawled off the bed and onto the floor. I didn't scream this time. I didn't faint. I just stared, frozen in shock and disbelief. She was there. The same blue-eyed woman who had kept me awake, haunting my dreams. Her body lay twisted and broken in the most unnatural way. Bloodied and contorted, her lifeless form should have been terrifying enough, but it was the expression on her face that paralyzed me. Fear. Helplessness. It was like her eyes were begging for someone to save her, even in death. I half expected her to move suddenly, to cross the short distance between us in some jerky, inhuman motion like in the horror movies I wasn't supposed to watch. But she didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't do anything. I don't know how long I stared at her before my body finally obeyed me again. Slowly, silently, I crawled back into my bed. I buried myself under the covers and cried. Quiet, desperate tears. I kept asking the universe, why me? Why is this happening to me? I cried until I had nothing left, eventually falling into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, my eyes were crusty and puffy from the tears and the lack of sleep. Groggy and disoriented, I dragged myself into the kitchen, greeted my family, and slumped into a chair. Good morning, my mom replied without turning around, busy flipping pancakes. It wasn't until my dad barked, "What the hell happened to your face?" that I realized I'd become the center of attention. Mom turned to look at me, eyebrows raised in concern. Your eyes are all swollen and crusty. Are you feeling okay? Jill, my older sister, grinned as she leaned in for a closer look. You look like absolute crap, she said with faux affection. Jill! My dad snapped, cutting her off with a glare. She rolled her eyes and went back to her cereal. Without thinking, I blurted, It's the woman under my bed. The room went dead silent. Before I could say another word, my dad slammed his coffee mug onto the table. Enough! He barked. But I said enough. This prank ends now. Do you hear me? It's over. When my dad made a decision, there was no arguing. He was a man who didn't tolerate challenges, and he made it crystal clear that he wouldn't entertain another word about it. The rest of breakfast was a quiet, tense affair. No one said much of anything. We all just played our roles and got on with our morning. But while I knew better than to bring it up again around my dad, school was a different story. Joey, my best friend and the only person I trusted with this secret, believed me without hesitation. The moment I told him about the woman under my bed, he leaned in with that familiar spark of curiosity in his eyes. She's gotta be some kind of ghost, Joey declared, rubbing his imaginary beard like he was deep in thought. I'd known Joey since kindergarten, and even back then, at the age of 5, he was obsessed with the supernatural. Ghost stories, UFOs, Bigfoot, you name it, he was into it. But I felt her hand. I countered, my voice low as we huddled together at lunch. Joey nodded sagely, as if this only strengthened his theory. Not all ghosts are, like, misty and see-through, dude, he explained. Some are solid. Some are stuck in this world for a reason, like unfinished business or whatever. I wasn't entirely sure I believed him, but it was a better explanation than thinking I was going insane. Joey concluded, with all the authority of a supernatural expert, that she was a lost soul trapped on this plane. Why she chose me to appear to, we had no idea. Why me, though? I asked. I mean, the biggest problems in my life are winning at Pokemon and beating the next level on my Game Boy. I'm not exactly qualified to help a ghost cross over. Joey shrugged. Maybe you're special. Like you've got some kind of aura or whatever that lets her connect with you. His words didn't reassure me. Helping a ghost find the light sounded like something out of a movie, not something I was ready to handle. And if I was going to help her, how was I even supposed to do that? Call a priest? Get a Ouija board? My parents would flip if I even brought up either of those ideas. The questions Joey raised bounced around in my head all day. By the time I got home, my nerves were already fried. The house was silent and empty, as usual. Both my parents worked late, and my sister, Ashley, had cheerleading practice. Normally, my after-school routine was simple: grab a snack, watch TV for half an hour, then finish my homework before my dad came home to inspect it. But not today. Today, I had a mission. I walked into my room, my heart racing as I stood at the edge of my bed. I told myself I had to figure out what she wanted, what the ghost was trying to tell me. I couldn't just ignore her. I took a deep breath and counted down from 10. "You've got this," I whispered to myself. But when I dropped to the ground and peered under the bed, all the courage I'd built up drained out of me in an instant. She was still there. Her body lay in the same twisted, unnatural position as before. The same piercing blue eyes stared back at me, filled with that same haunting sadness. But her appearance had changed. Her skin had dulled to a sickly ashen gray. In some places, it sagged and drooped, giving the impression it might peel right off her bones. In other spots, it was taut and stretched, especially across her face. Her gaunt, skeletal features looked more terrifying than before, like she was wasting away in real time. I didn't know much about death at that age, but I'd seen enough dead animals in the woods to recognize decay. And then the smell hit me. It was a putrid, sickly sweet stench that turned my stomach instantly. I bolted from the room and barely made it to the bathroom before I lost my lunch. My entire body shook as I clung to the toilet, waves of nausea washing over me. Whatever was happening under my bed wasn't just in my imagination. It was real. It took less than 30 seconds for my dad's eyes to lock onto mine when he walked through the door. My stomach dropped, and I swallowed hard against the knot that had been tightening in my throat ever since I'd heard the truck pull into the yard. I tried to get ahead of his inevitable anger, words spilling out of my mouth faster than I could think. I told him everything, about the decaying skin, the putrid smell, and those piercing ocean blue eyes that wouldn't leave me alone. But my explanation fell on deaf ears. In one swift motion, Dad grabbed me by the arm and dragged me toward my bedroom door. His mutterings weren't entirely clear, but I caught a few familiar phrases. "Waste of my time," and "idiotic young'un." Those were two of his favorites, ones we heard on a regular basis. He reached the door and yanked it open with such force that the hinges groaned. Then, with a hand still gripping my arm like a vice, he used the other to lift my entire bed, frame, mattress, and all, and slammed it upright against the wall. My dad was a big, naturally strong man, and lifting the bed one-handed wasn't a challenge for him on a normal day. But when he was in one of his infamous rages, it felt like there wasn't anything he couldn't move. He could probably flip a car if he wanted to. Through the chaos of my crying, gagging, and his furious yelling, I saw her. She was still there. Still lying in that same deathly pose, her decaying skin and haunting eyes burning into my soul. I couldn't understand it. How could he not see her? Or smell her? My father turned toward me, his face red with fury. He pulled me close, his breath hot and sharp as he growled through clenched teeth. "If you keep pulling these fucking pranks, there will be a body under this bed, and it'll be yours." The house was quiet for the rest of the evening, as it always was after one of Dad's outbursts. Silence wasn't uncommon in our home. It lingered for days the first time he smashed the television. My father wasn't exactly the loving, nurturing type. We didn't have the kind of relationship you'd see on TV with fathers and sons bonding over baseball or fishing trips. From as far back as I could remember, Dad had written me off as a lost cause. I didn't share his innate aggression or his idea of what a real man should be, and that was enough for him to give up on me entirely. As much as the smell wafting from under my bed made me gag, it couldn't compare to the fear of my father's wrath. His rage was a far scarier monster than the ghost girl beneath me. That night, sleep was out of the question. The first couple of hours were spent alternating between gagging and choking back the urge to vomit, the stench unbearable even after all this time. When I finally adjusted to the smell, the quiet sobs started. I cried until my body couldn't take it anymore, until exhaustion finally forced my eyes shut. But sleep didn't bring peace. It brought nightmares. In my dreams, her face was everywhere, those hollow cheeks and piercing blue eyes that seemed to stare right through me. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat and tears, only to start the cycle all over again. It was a long night, and the fear in my chest felt like it would never go away. This was my new normal, nights spent tossing, turning, gagging, and crying, followed by days of complete exhaustion. The lack of sleep was etched into my face, evident in my bloodshot eyes and dark circles. My family noticed. I could tell by the way my mom glanced at me with thinly veiled concern. But no one dared say a word. Not when the risk of triggering my father's rage loomed over us all like a storm cloud. Occasionally, I forced myself to check on the state of my uninvited bunkmate. Each time, the sight of her sent a fresh wave of nausea crashing over me. Her decaying form seemed to wither more with each passing day. Her skin sagged and stretched in unnatural ways, graying further into a grotesque mask of death. Sometimes I caught myself hoping she'd eventually decay into nothingness, that she'd disappear completely, leaving no trace of her horrific presence. But the more I thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. My nightmares grew worse during this time. The dreams were vivid, like scenes ripped straight from a horror movie. I saw her running through the woods, not jogging, but sprinting, terrified, as though her life depended on it. Branches clawed at her, and debris scraped her legs as she darted through the underbrush. Her head would whip back over her shoulder, her wide, panic-stricken eyes searching for whatever was chasing her. It wasn't just the sight of her fear that haunted me. I could feel it. The raw, unfiltered terror that coursed through her seemed to pulse through me too. That sheer, gut-wrenching panic was something I'd only ever seen in the eyes of my family when my father was at his most dangerous. It was the fear of knowing something awful was about to happen and being utterly powerless to stop it. The dreams became darker and more twisted as the nights wore on. Eventually, her pursuer caught up to her. I'll spare you the details of what happened next, but even in the context of a dream, the violence was too visceral, too graphic, to feel like fiction. I woke drenched in sweat, shaking as her final moments replayed in my mind. This woman had chosen to appear to me. She was showing me her life, or rather, the end of it. But why? What did she want from me? I tried to piece it together, scanning local news sites for stories of missing or murdered women who might match her appearance. I searched obsessively, but I never found anything. It felt like I was hitting a wall at every turn. Meanwhile, I could feel myself deteriorating. The sleepless nights, the nightmares, the constant fear, it was all taking its toll. I started to wonder if I'd wither away alongside her, my own body succumbing to the stress and exhaustion. Through it all, my mother was my lifeline. She was a small, soft-spoken woman who never raised her voice, not even when my father was at his worst. She followed his rules without question, at least when he was watching. But behind his back, she found small ways to protect me. On nights when my father decided I didn't deserve dinner, usually as punishment for some perceived slight, she would sneak a plate into my room in the dead of night. I'd hear the faint creak of the door opening, and there she'd be, balancing a plate of food and mouthing, "Eat quickly." She saved me in more ways than one. But even her quiet acts of rebellion couldn't shield me from the heavy weight of my situation. Every day, I saw the worry in her eyes, even as she tried to hide it. And every day, I asked myself the same questions: why me? Why is she here? And what am I supposed to do? After what felt like an eternity, everything ended on a bright, sunny day. The kind of day that felt at odds with the darkness I'd been living in for what seemed like years. I hadn't checked on my specter in a while. By this point, she was little more than a skeleton. Her decaying body had deteriorated to the point where I couldn't even tell it had been human once. But somehow, her face resisted the pull of death. The blue of her eyes remained as vivid as the first time I saw them. I prepared myself for that same haunting gaze as I crouched down and peered under my bed, flashlight in hand. Instead, I found nothing. Well, not nothing. There was a water bottle, a pair of mismatched socks, and my old baseball mitt, but she was gone. Relief washed over me at first, but it was quickly overtaken by something heavier: sadness. Deep, aching sadness. I knew she was real. I knew everything I'd seen, everything I'd experienced, had been real. Though I had no proof, I knew she had suffered. And whatever she had endured, it wasn't something any human should have to go through. My heart hurt for her. We weren't a religious family. My dad openly mocked people who prayed, but in that moment, I whispered a quiet prayer. I didn't ask for much, just that she was at peace. As the day wore on, the sadness started to fade, replaced by a feeling I couldn't quite name at first. Anxiety crept in, settling like a weight in my chest. It didn't make sense. My ordeal was over, wasn't it? But the unease lingered, growing stronger as the hours ticked by. By lunchtime, I felt like I couldn't sit still. Something was wrong, I just didn't know what. Then, not long after lunch, my life took a turn I never could have seen coming. My principal, Mr. Cash, showed up at my classroom door. His appearance startled me. He rarely left his office unless it was for something serious. "Jack, can you come with me for a moment?" he asked, his usual cheerful tone replaced by something quieter, more somber. I wasn't an angel, but I'd never been sent to the principal's office before. Not once. As we walked the eerily quiet 2 minutes to his office, I racked my brain, trying to figure out what I could have done wrong. When we arrived, the door swung open, and my heart dropped. My sister, Jill, sat in the corner of the room, her face pale and tear-streaked. Mr. Cash, a man who was always smiling, wore an expression that could only be described as grave. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. "Your aunt is on her way to pick you up," he said gently. "There's been an incident." Jill burst into tears immediately, her sobs filling the small office. I sat frozen, my mind racing. An incident? What kind of incident? Why wasn't Mom coming to get us? Were our parents hurt? Was it Mom? Did Dad hurt her? Mr. Cash stood up and walked toward the door. He paused beside me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. I wanted to believe him, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. Then he left, leaving Jill and me alone to wait in that suffocating silence. The sound of Jill's muffled sobs filled the principal's office, a heartbreaking counterpoint to the pounding of my own heart. It was so loud in my ears that it felt like the only thing I could hear. Each second dragged on, agonizingly slow, until the pounding gave way to a high-pitched ringing. The longer we sat there, the louder the ringing grew, building to a fever pitch that made me feel like I might burst. Then the door swung open. Our aunt stepped inside, her face tense and lined with worry. She looked at us for a long moment before she finally spoke. "There's been an incident," she said carefully, as though choosing her words was a delicate balancing act. "Your parents are okay, but you'll be staying with me for a little while." Her tone was gentle but firm, and her vague explanation only raised more questions. Jill and I fired them at her one after another. "What kind of incident? Why can't we go home? What's going on with Mom and Dad?" But our aunt wouldn't budge. She shook her head and repeated the same answer over and over. "Your mother will explain everything when we get home." When we arrived at our aunt's house, we found Mom sitting stiffly on the couch. She looked hollowed out, her face blank and distant, but the redness and puffiness around her eyes betrayed how much she'd been crying. The moment she saw us, she opened her arms, and we ran to her without hesitation. Jill and I melted into her embrace, burying our faces in her shoulders as though we could disappear into her warmth. For a few seconds the world seemed to stand still. I still didn't know what had happened, but I was thankful to be with Mom, to feel the safety and comfort of her arms. Eventually she pulled back, her hands gripping ours as she looked at us with heavy, tear-filled eyes. Jill and I took our seats on either side of her, bracing ourselves for whatever she was about to say. Mom's hands trembled slightly as she held ours, and her voice cracked as she began to speak. "Your father did a very, very bad thing," she said quietly. "And he won't be coming home anytime soon. Maybe ever." Her words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Jill and I exchanged confused glances before looking back at Mom. She took a deep breath, her lips pressing into a thin line as though trying to summon the strength to continue. She told us that our father had murdered a woman during one of his supposed work trips, a woman in another state. She didn't go into detail, sparing us from the worst of it. But her voice shook as she spoke, and I could see the pain etched across her face. Mom didn't have to tell us much for us to realize how terrible it was. To shield us from stumbling upon the gruesome details, Mom banned cable TV and took away our internet access. "You'll be staying home from school for the rest of the week," she added. "Maybe longer." Under normal circumstances, a week off school would have been a dream come true for a 12-year-old. But this didn't feel like a break. It felt like we'd been plunged into a nightmare, and there was no waking up. The house was quiet after that. Too quiet. I could feel the weight of my mother's grief pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. We didn't talk much for the rest of the night. The silence, punctuated only by the occasional sniffle from Jill or a sigh from Mom, felt suffocating. All I could think about was the woman under my bed, her lifeless eyes staring up at me. My father's words echoed in my head. "If you keep pulling these pranks, there will be a body under this bed, and it'll be yours." Now I knew he hadn't just been threatening me. That night, while the rest of the house had succumbed to sleep, I tiptoed into the living room. My aunt had hidden the remote, but I found it easily enough. I turned on the local news station, lowering the volume to barely a whisper. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, answers, maybe, or some kind of confirmation that everything happening was real. And then I saw her. Her photo filled the screen, her bright smile shining through the grainy image. She wore a jet-black cap and gown, her diploma clutched proudly in one hand. There was no mistaking those piercing blue eyes. Anna Elizabeth Collins. She was only 19, just a few years older than Jill. The newscaster's voice narrated her tragic story, the words cutting through the silence of the room like a blade. Anna had been a free spirit, someone who took risks and trusted too easily. She'd fallen in with a dangerous crowd shortly after graduating high school. Hitchhiking was her way of getting around, and it was while catching a ride with a stranger that she disappeared. Hikers found her body deep in the woods weeks later. And the man last seen giving her a ride? He matched the description of my father. My father and his work truck. The police had been tailing him for weeks, waiting for him to make a mistake. They retrieved DNA from a cigarette he'd carelessly tossed to the ground, and it wasn't just a match for Anna. It tied him to 2 other missing persons cases as well. The weight of everything crashed over me as I stared at Anna's photo, her vibrant eyes staring back at me. I should have felt anger, disgust, or even despair. But instead, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Despite everything Anna had suffered, I knew, in that moment, that she was at rest now. Her torment was over. I turned off the TV, set the remote aside, and lay on the couch. For the first time in weeks, I drifted off to sleep without fear. That night, there were no nightmares. No tossing and turning. No haunting cries. Instead, I dreamed of my room, bathed in soft light. Everything felt still, calm. And then she appeared. Anna stood in the doorway, looking just as she had in her photos. Her face wasn't twisted in fear or marred by decay. It was serene, angelic even. She glided across the room, her presence filling the space with warmth and light. When she reached me, she placed her hands gently on my shoulders. Her touch was soft, grounding me in a way nothing else had since this nightmare began. Without a word, she pulled me into an embrace. In that moment, I felt the weight of everything, my grief, my fear, my confusion, lift from my shoulders. I knew life would be different for my family and me from now on. My father's actions had torn our world apart, and it would take time to rebuild. But as Anna's light surrounded me, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. We would be okay.